The snow fell heavy that December night in Promise Creek, Montana, each flake adding to the white blanket that already covered the small frontier town. The stagecoach had left her at the edge of Main Street 3 hours past sunset, its driver eager to reach the next station before the storm worsened. Now. Mary Grace Sullivan stood alone in the swirling darkness, her worn traveling dress offering little protection against the bitter wind. 28 winters had passed over her, leaving their mark in the tired lines around her green eyes and the way her shoulders curved inward, as if protecting something fragile within. Her dark hair, once pinned neat for the journey, now hung loose beneath her bonnet, damp with the melting snow. In her hand, she clutched a small canvas bag containing all she owned, 2 faded dresses, a few undergarments, and wrapped in a piece of calico at the very bottom, a gold wedding band that had never touched her finger. The town slept under the storm's fury. Windows glowed faintly behind drawn curtains, but no door opened to welcome a stranger. Mary Grace had not expected otherwise. She had no name to give at any respectable household, no letter of introduction, no family waiting. She was merely another soul running from a past too painful to carry, seeking only a place to rest before moving on. Her feet, numb in thin boots meant for eastern streets, carried her past the shuttered general store, past the saloon where rough laughter spilled into the night, past the church with its modest steeple pointing toward heaven. At the town's edge, she spotted an old storage shed, its door hanging slightly ajar. It wasn't much, but it would shield her from the wind. "I'll just sleep and go," she whispered to herself, the words barely audible above the storm. Her legs, weary from days of travel, finally gave way as she reached the wooden porch of the shed. She sank down, drawing her knees to her chest, trying to make herself small enough to disappear entirely. That's when she heard it, the creak of a door, not from the shed, but from the modest house beside it. Yellow lamplight spilled across the snow, and in that light stood the silhouette of a man, tall and broad-shouldered. "You fixing to freeze to death on my property?" The voice was deep, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world despite the storm. Mary Grace lifted her head, squinting against the sudden light. "I meant no harm, sir. I'll move along." In this weather, he stepped out onto his own porch, and she could see him better now, perhaps 32 or 33 years, with dark hair that needed cutting and a face that suggested he'd forgotten how to smile. He wore no coat despite the cold, just a worn flannel shirt and canvas trousers. "You can sleep," he said, each word deliberate. "But you ain't leaving. Not tonight." "I don't take charity," Mary Grace managed through chattering teeth. "Didn't offer any." He turned back toward his door. "I got a fire going and soup that'll spoil if no one eats it. You can sit by the stove or sit in the snow. Makes no difference to me." Pride warred with survival, but the cold had already won. Mary Grace struggled to her feet, her frozen skirts crackling as she moved. She followed him, each step an act of surrender. The inside of Thomas Wade's house was sparse but clean. A main room served as kitchen and living space, with a large iron stove radiating blessed warmth. 2 doors led off to what she assumed were bedrooms. A rifle hung above the mantel, and leather tack decorated one wall bridles and reins and tools for working with horses. "Sit," he said, pointing to a wooden chair near the stove. He moved to the pot simmering on top, stirring with practiced movements. "Nothing fancy, just beef and winter vegetables." Mary Grace sat, her hands shaking as she removed her sodden gloves. The warmth hit her like a physical thing, painful at first as feeling returned to her fingers and toes. She watched him ladle soup into 2 bowls, his movements efficient, economical. This was a man accustomed to solitude. "Thank you," she said when he placed the bowl before her. He grunted in response, taking his own seat across the small table. They ate in silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against earthenware and the wind howling outside. The soup was simple but good, flavored with herbs she couldn't name. "Got a name?" he asked finally. Mary Grace. She hesitated, then added, Sullivan. Thomas Wade. He studied her with dark eyes that seemed to see too much. You running from or running to? Does it matter? Not particularly. He rose, collected their empty bowls. You can have the settee tonight. There's blankets in that chest. Privy's out back if you need it, but I wouldn't recommend it till the storm passes. Mary Grace looked at the settee, a rough-made piece that would be paradise compared to the frozen ground outside. I'll be gone come morning. Thomas paused in his washing up, his back to her. Storm like this could last days. Besides, he turned, fixing her with that steady gaze. Where exactly you planning to go? She had no answer. California had been a vague dream, somewhere far enough away that the past couldn't follow, but she had no money for passage, no connections, no plan beyond the next sunrise. That's what I thought. He dried his hands on a cloth. I run horses for the mail station. Always got work needs doing. You can earn your keep till you figure out your next step. I don't know anything about horses. Don't need to. Can you cook? Some. Can you mend? She glanced at his shirt, noted the clumsy repairs. Better than you, appears. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. Then we'll get along fine. He moved toward one of the doors. There's coffee fixings for morning. Help yourself. He paused at the threshold. And Mary Grace's door stays unbarred. You want to leave, you leave. But do us both a favor and wait for daylight. With that, he disappeared into his room, leaving her alone with the stove's warmth and the storm's fury. Mary Grace sat for a long time, staring at the flames visible through the stove's grate. She'd run so far, carried her shame and grief like stones in her chest. Here, in this simple room with its sparse furnishings and honest warmth, she felt something she hadn't expected, the possibility of rest. She made her bed on the settee, wrapping herself in blankets that smelled of cedar and smoke. Outside, the wind continued its assault, but inside, she was safe. Tomorrow she would leave, she told herself. Tomorrow she would continue running. But as sleep finally claimed her, Mary Grace Sullivan allowed herself one moment of weakness, one fleeting thought. What if she didn't? What if, just for a while, she stopped running and simply stayed still? In his room, Thomas Wade lay awake, listening to the storm and the quiet sounds of another person in his house. It had been 3 years since anyone had shared this space. 3 years of silence broken only by horse sounds and wind. He didn't know why he'd invited her in, could have directed her to the boarding house in town, could have sent her on her way. But something in how she'd sat on that cold porch, preparing to endure rather than ask for help, had stirred recognition in him. He knew what it was to carry wounds that wouldn't heal, to build walls so high that even kindness couldn't scale them. Let her stay the night, he thought. Come morning, she'd be gone like all the others who passed through Promise Creek seeking something better, and his life would return to its careful rhythm of work and solitude. Neither of them could know that morning would come and go, and Mary Grace Sullivan would still be there. That days would stretch into weeks, and the stranger on his porch would become something far more dangerous than either of them intended home. Morning came gray and silent, the storm having blown itself out sometime before dawn. Mary Grace woke to the sound of coffee percolating and bacon sizzling, scents that seemed foreign after months of cold camps and charity meals. She sat up, momentarily disoriented, then remembered the storm, the shed, the taciturn man who'd taken her in. Thomas Wade stood at the stove, his back to her, moving with the same quiet efficiency she'd noted the night before. He'd already been outside, snow clung to his boots, and his dark hair was damp. Through the window, she could see the world transformed into pristine white, unmarked save for a single set of tracks leading to the barn. Coffee's ready, he said without turning. Breakfast in 5 minutes. Mary Grace folded the blankets carefully, trying to make it seem as if she'd never been there. Her traveling dress was wrinkled beyond redemption. but she smoothed it as best she could. At the small mirror hanging by the door, she attempted to pin up her hair, aware of how road-worn she must appear. "No need for fussing," Thomas said, setting 2 plates on the table. "Horses don't care what you look like." She turned from the mirror. "I should be going." "Should you?" He poured coffee into thick ceramic mugs. "Where exactly town's snowed in. Won't be any stages running for days, maybe a week." Mary Grace's heart sank. She hadn't considered that possibility. Perhaps someone needs help at the boarding house? "Mrs. Winters runs that place tighter than a drum. Has her own girls for helping." He sat down, gestured for her to do the same. "Eat. Then we'll see about earning your keep." The breakfast was simple but filling: bacon, biscuits, and preserved peaches. Thomas ate steadily, his attention seemingly fixed on his plate, but Mary Grace felt him watching her, not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but with a kind of careful assessment, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "I can pay," she said suddenly. "Not much, but—" "Keep your money." He pushed the peach jar toward her. "Have more. You look like a stiff wind would knock you over." After breakfast, he led her outside. The cold hit like a slap, but the sun was trying to break through the clouds. His property stretched back from the house a modest barn, several corrals, and a larger pasture where dark shapes moved against the snow. 22 horses, he said, pulling on leather gloves. "I keep them fit through winter, train the young ones, fix what needs fixing. Come spring, the mail contract starts up again." "You do all this alone?" "Have done for 3 years." He opened the barn door, revealing a warm, hay-scented interior. Horses nickered in their stalls, heads turning toward them with interest. "You ever handle horses?" "No." "Good. Means you got no bad habits to break." He moved down the aisle, checking water buckets. "First rule, they're bigger than you, stronger than you, but mostly they just want food and kindness. Respect them. They'll respect you." Mary Grace followed, overwhelmed by the size of the animals, their liquid eyes and velvet noses. One, a bay mare with a white blaze, stretched her neck toward her. "That's Buttercup," Thomas said. "Gentlest thing on 4 legs. Go on, let her smell you." Tentatively, Mary Grace extended her hand. The mare's whiskers tickled her palm, warm breath ghosting over her fingers. Something tight in her chest loosened just a fraction. "I'll start you with brushing," Thomas said. "Work the tangles out. Check for cuts or swelling. These animals are my livelihood. I need to know someone can tend them proper if I'm away." "You're hiring me." He shrugged. "Calling it what you want. You need a place. I need help. Simple as that." Nothing about it felt simple, but Mary Grace found herself nodding. The next hours passed in a blur of instruction. How to approach a horse safely. How to run her hands down their legs, checking for heat or swelling. How to use the different brushes, curry comb in circles, hard brush with the grain, soft brush for faces. Thomas demonstrated each task with patient precision, his large hands gentle despite their obvious strength. "You're good with them," she observed, watching him work a tangle from a young gelding's tail. "Easier than people," he said. "Horses don't lie, don't pretend. They are what they are." By midday, Mary Grace's arms ached and her back protested, but she'd successfully groomed 3 horses under Thomas's watchful eye. They returned to the house for a simple lunch of bread and cold beef. "There's a room," he said abruptly, not looking at her. "Back of the house. Used to be for storage, but it's got a bed and stove. Needs cleaning, but it's private. You're welcome to it." Mary Grace set down her cup carefully. "I don't. That wouldn't be proper. People would talk." "People always talk." His jaw tightened. "You prefer the gossip to freezing because those are your choices. Take the room or don't. But decide quick. Got 3 more horses need tending before dark." She thought of the nights spent in barns and beneath bridges, the constant fear of who might find her, what they might do. Here was shelter, work, a man who seemed to want nothing from her but honest labor. "I'll take it," she said quietly. "Thank you." The room was small but adequate, with a narrow bed, a pot-bellied stove, and a single window looking out toward the mountains. Dust covered everything, and cobwebs draped the corners, but Mary Grace had lived in worse, much worse. Thomas brought her cleaning supplies, bedding, and an armload of wood for the stove. "There's a bolt for the door," he said. "Use it. I won't come back here unless invited."
Mr. Wade.
"Thomas, we're working together now. Might as well drop the formalities." Thomas. The name felt strange on her tongue. "Why are you doing this?" He paused in the doorway, his broad shoulders filling the frame. For a moment, she thought he might actually answer, might reveal something of the man beneath the reserved exterior. But he only said, "Everyone needs help sometimes. Today it's you, tomorrow it might be me." She spent the afternoon making the space habitable, sweeping and scrubbing with the energy born of having something that was hers, however temporary, between tasks. She helped with the evening feeding, learning to measure oats and hay, to break ice from water troughs. As darkness fell, they ate another simple meal in companionable silence. Mary Grace noticed things she'd missed before the careful way Thomas moved, favoring his left shoulder. The books lined on a shelf, spines worn from reading, a daguerreotype on the mantel, turned face down. "I can start supper tomorrow," she offered. "And I saw those shirts needing mending." "If you're inclined." He cleared the dishes. "Town's about a mile walk when the weather's clear. You'll need supplies, women things. Make a list. I'll fetch them." The thoughtfulness surprised her. "I can go myself." "Best you don't?" "Not yet." Something in his tone suggested he knew more than he was saying. "Let folks get used to the idea first. Small towns don't take kindly to surprises." That night, alone in her small room with the door bolted and the stove crackling, Mary Grace allowed herself to think about staying. Not forever, she'd learned better than to think in forevers, but for a while. Long enough to earn some money, to rest, to remember who she was beneath the grief and shame. Outside, she heard Thomas's footsteps on the porch, the sound of him checking the stock one last time before bed. A careful man, she thought, a lonely one. Too, though he wore it like armor rather than a wound. She pulled out her small bag, fingering the wrapped ring at the bottom. William's ring, bought with such hope. Never worn because his family had found out about the child, about her lack of suitable connections. His mother had made the situation clear: marry the eldest daughter or be cut off entirely. The child, their child, hadn't survived long enough to complicate matters further. Mary Grace wrapped the ring again, pushed it deep into the bag. Tomorrow she would start fresh, would prove herself useful enough to stay. She wouldn't think about William or the baby or the way her stepbrother had looked at her after the funeral, his intentions clear in his whiskey-soaked gaze. She wouldn't think about any of it. Instead, she'd think about 22 horses needing care, about shirts needing mending, about a taciturn man who'd offered shelter without demanding anything in return. It wasn't a life. Not really, but it was a beginning. In the main house, Thomas Wade sat by his fire, trying to read but finding his attention wandering. 3 years he'd lived alone, 3 years of careful routine and measured solitude. Now there was a woman in his back room, a woman with wounded eyes and secrets she held like broken glass. He should have sent her to town, should have maintained the walls he'd built so carefully after Clara died, after the baby followed her 3 days later. But something about finding her on that porch, ready to freeze rather than ask for help, had cracked through his defenses. Just temporary, he muttered to the empty room. Come spring, she'd move on like everyone did, and he'd return to his horses and his silence. Exactly as it should be. But even as he thought it, Thomas knew he was lying to himself. Mary Grace Sullivan had brought something back into his house besides her meager belongings. She'd brought possibility, and that was the most dangerous thing of all. The days settled into a rhythm as natural as breathing. Mary Grace would wake before dawn, stoking the fire in her small stove before making her way to the main house. She'd find Thomas already up, coffee started, preparing for the morning feed. They'd work in companionable silence, their movements becoming synchronized through repetition. By the end of the first week, she could harness a horse without his oversight, knew which ones liked their ears scratched and which preferred a wide berth until after breakfast. Her hands, once soft from a life of genteel pursuits, grew calloused but capable. "You're taking to it," Thomas observed one morning, watching her work a curry comb over Buttercup's coat. The mare stood placid, occasionally swishing her tail in contentment. "They're good teachers," Mary Grace replied, not mentioning how the simple, repetitive work quieted the churning in her mind, how the horse's uncomplicated affection felt like balm on old wounds. In the evenings, after supper, she would mend. Thomas had produced a basket of clothing in various states of disrepair: shirts with torn seams, trousers with worn knees, socks that were more whole than fabric. She'd raised an eyebrow at the last. "Not much point in those," she'd said, holding up a particularly hopeless specimen. "Been meaning to throw them out," he admitted, a faint color rising in his weathered cheeks. "Just never got around to it." She'd salvaged what she could, turning worn shirts into cleaning rags, patching what was worth patching. As she worked, Thomas would tend to his leather gear or read, the fire crackling between them. Sometimes he'd share observations about the horses, which ones were coming along in their training, which might make good breeding stock. "You planning to expand?" she asked one evening, fingers flying over a particularly stubborn tear. "Maybe. Mail contract's good, but it won't last forever. Railroad's coming. They say 5, maybe 10 years. Won't be much call for horse-drawn mail delivery." "What then?" He shrugged. "Cattle, maybe. Or horses for the army. Man's got to adapt or get left behind." It was the most he'd said about the future since she'd arrived. Mary Grace found herself wondering if she'd still be here to see those changes, then pushed the thought away. No sense in planning that far ahead. The second week brought clearer weather, and with it, the need for supplies. Thomas hitched up the wagon one morning, producing a list they'd compiled together. "Sure you won't come?" he asked, though they both knew the answer. "Best not," Mary Grace said. "Not yet." He nodded, understanding without explanation. Small towns had long memories and quick judgments. Better to let him test the waters first. She spent the day alone, a strange luxury after weeks of constant movement and fear. The horses needed little fresh water, a bit of hay. She found herself lingering in the barn, comforted by their presence. Buttercup especially seemed to sense her mood, resting her large head on Mary Grace's shoulder in quiet companionship. "You don't care where I came from, do you?" she murmured to the mare. "Don't care what I've done or left undone." The horse nickered softly, and Mary Grace felt tears prick her eyes for the first time since arriving. She'd been running on pure survival for so long. She'd forgotten what it felt like to simply exist without immediate threat. Thomas returned near dusk, the wagon loaded with supplies. His expression was carefully neutral as he began unloading. "Any trouble?" Mary Grace asked, helping with the lighter packages. "No trouble," but something in his tone suggested otherwise. He handed her a wrapped bundle. "Mrs. Henderson at the Mercantile sent these. Said they were taking up space in her back room. Inside were 2 serviceable dresses, well made if plain, and various undergarments, all clearly new despite Mrs. Henderson's claim." Mary Grace's throat tightened. That was kind of her. Sarah Henderson's good people. Her husband, too. They'll keep quiet until you're ready. The unspoken implication hung between them that eventually she would need to be ready, would need to face the town and whatever gossip was already spreading, but not today. That night, she made stew with the fresh vegetables Thomas had brought, seasoning it with herbs from small packets she found in the kitchen. He ate with obvious appreciation, going back for seconds. "Been a while since anyone cooked proper food in this kitchen," he said, mopping the bowl with fresh bread. "Your wife?" The words slipped out before Mary Grace could stop them. She'd noticed the marks of a woman's touch throughout the house, curtains faded but carefully hung, a quilt clearly made with loving hands. Thomas's hand stilled. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, quietly, "Clara, 3 years gone this spring." "I'm sorry." "Fever took her. And the baby." His voice was steady, but she heard the effort it cost him. Doc did what he could, but some things... He stood abruptly, carrying his bowl to the wash basin. "Some things can't be fixed." Mary Grace wanted to offer comfort, to share her own loss. But the moment passed. Thomas excused himself to check the horses one final time, leaving her alone with the dishes and the weight of unspoken grief. Days flowed into each other, marked by small progressions. Mary Grace learned to predict weather changes by how the horses behaved, to doctor minor cuts with the salve Thomas showed her how to make. She discovered he had a sweet tooth, carefully hoarding the sugar for his coffee, and took to making simple cakes when supplies allowed. "You'll make me fat," he grumbled one evening, accepting a second slice of spice cake. "Doubt that," she replied, noting how his clothes hung loose despite the physical nature of his work. Grief, she knew, could eat a person from the inside out. The third week brought an unexpected visitor. Mary Grace was in the barn, measuring out the evening feed, when she heard voices from the yard. She peered through a crack in the door, seeing Thomas talking with a well-dressed older woman. "Simply isn't proper. Thomas Wade," the woman was saying. "An unmarried woman, no references, no family. With respect, Mrs. Carlyle. My household arrangements are my own business." "Your business becomes the town's business when you're flouting all decent convention." What would Clara think? Even from the barn, Mary Grace could see Thomas stiffen. When he spoke, his voice was dangerously quiet. Clara thought kindness mattered more than convention. "Now, if you've said your piece, I've got work to do." "Mrs. Carlyle huffed, gathering her skirts. "Don't say you weren't warned when this all goes wrong. Thomas Wade, that girl is trouble. Mark my words." After she left, Mary Grace emerged from the barn. Thomas stood rigid, staring at the dust cloud from Mrs. Carlyle's buggy. "I should go," Mary Grace said softly. "I don't want to cause you trouble." He turned, and she was surprised to see not anger, but a kind of weary resignation in his eyes. "Eleanor Carlyle's been causing trouble since before I was born. Pay her no mind." "But if people are talking..." "People always talk. Said that first day. Didn't I?" He took the feed bucket from her hands. "You planning to run every time someone disapproves? Because if so, you'll be running your whole life." The truth of it hit like cold water. She had been running, from judgment, from pain, from the possibility of standing still long enough to feel. "I don't know how to stop," she admitted. "Sure you do." He headed for the barn, glancing back. "You just did it. 3 weeks now. You've been stopped. World hasn't ended. Has it?" That night, unable to sleep, Mary Grace sat by her small window, watching snow begin to fall again. In the morning, it would mean extra work breaking ice, spreading more hay, checking the horses' hooves for packed snow. But she found herself looking forward to it, to the routine that had somehow become hers. She thought about Thomas's words, about running and stopping, about Clara, dead 3 years, and the baby who'd never drawn breath, about her own losses, still too raw to examine closely. They were alike, she and Thomas, both carrying wounds that wouldn't quite heal. Maybe that's why he'd let her stay recognizing a fellow refugee from grief. Or maybe, she thought, watching his shadow move past the main house windows as he made his final rounds. Maybe he was just lonely. It wasn't love. What was growing between them? Not yet, but it was something understanding, perhaps. or simply the comfort of another heartbeat in the silence. Mary Grace rose, preparing for bed. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. No doubt, more disapproving visitors, more careful negotiations of propriety and perception. But tonight, she was warm and safe and useful. Tonight, that was enough. In the main house, Thomas stood before the mantel, holding the photograph he'd kept face down for 3 years. Clara smiled back at him, frozen in time, her hand resting on the barely visible swell that would never become the child they'd dreamed of. "She's nothing like you," he said quietly to the image. "Scared as a wild thing, proud as sin. Don't even know her whole story yet." But Clara would have liked her, he thought, would have seen past the defensive walls to the good heart beneath, would have insisted on helping. Propriety be damned. He set the photograph upright for the first time since the funeral. Maybe it was time to stop living like he died with them. Maybe having Mary Grace here, difficult as it might prove, was Clara's way of telling him to rejoin the living. Or maybe he was just a fool, letting a pretty face and sad story cloud his judgment. Time would tell. It always did. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in temporary peace, and in a small room at the back of the house, Mary Grace Sullivan slept without nightmares for the first time in months, lulled by the distant sound of horses and the knowledge that tomorrow she had somewhere to be. Spring crept into Promise Creek with tentative fingers, melting snow revealing muddy earth and the first brave shoots of grass. Mary Grace had been at Thomas's ranch for 3 months now, long enough that the rhythms of the place had become second nature. She knew which horses would test the fence gates when they smelled spring air, which stalls needed extra reinforcement against spring floods. What she hadn't expected was the letter. Thomas brought it back from town one April morning, his expression carefully neutral. Mary Grace Sullivan was written across the front in elegant script she recognized with a lurch of her stomach. "My mother," she said unnecessarily, taking it with trembling fingers. "I'll be in the barn," Thomas said, giving her privacy. She sat at the kitchen table for a long moment, staring at the unopened letter. 3 months of silence, of building a new life layer by careful layer. And now the past had found her. With shaking hands, she broke the seal. Asterisk, my dear Mary Grace. Asterisk, your stepbrother informed me of your sudden departure. While I cannot condone the manner of your leaving, I confess relief at knowing you are alive. William married Charlotte Pemberton last month. I thought you should know. Whatever happened between you and I, do not wish to know the particulars. I hope you have found peace. Asterisk, your loving mother, asterisk. Mary Grace read it twice, then folded it carefully. William married. To his parents' choice, as expected. The child they'd created together, brief as its existence had been, not even worthy of mention. She pressed a hand to her stomach, remembering. Bad news. Thomas's voice from the doorway made her jump. "No, yes, I don't know." She stood, busying herself with the coffee pot. "Nothing that changes anything." He didn't press, for which she was grateful. But that evening, as she mended yet another of his shirts, the words spilled out. "I was engaged, unofficially. His family didn't know at first I wasn't suitable. My father was a schoolteacher. My mother remarried after he died to a man with some property but no real standing." She focused on her stitching, unable to meet his eyes. "When William found out when I told him there would be a child, he promised we'd marry quickly. But his mother discovered our plans." Thomas sat silent, whittling a piece of wood into what might become a horse. "She made it clear that William would be cut off entirely if he married me. No inheritance, no position in his father's firm. He agonized for days." Mary Grace's laugh was bitter. "I actually felt sorry for him. Can you imagine? Then I lost the baby. It was early. The doctor said these things happen and suddenly the problem was solved. William could marry who his parents wished, and I could be quietly forgotten. But your stepbrother," her hand stilled. Decided a woman who'd already fallen might be willing to fall again. He made his interest clear. The night before I left, he tried to... She swallowed hard. I hit him with a fireplace poker and ran. Took what money I could find and ran. The whittling had stopped. When she finally looked up, Thomas's knuckles were white around his knife. Should have hit him harder, he said quietly. Despite everything, Mary Grace felt her lips twitch. The thought occurred to me. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of revelation settling between them. Then Thomas resumed his carving, and she her sewing, and somehow the world didn't end. That why you haven't gone to town? He asked eventually. Partly, afraid someone might recognize me, might have heard stupid, I know. We're 1,000 miles from Boston. Not stupid, careful. He held up the carved piece, definitely a horse now, with flowing mane and proud stance. Nothing wrong with careful. The next morning brought unexpected warmth, and with it, Thomas's announcement that they needed supplies from town. I could go alone, he offered, as he had every time before. But Mary Grace thought of the letter, of 3 months of hiding, of Thomas's quiet acceptance of her story. No, she said, surprising them both. I'll come. The ride to town was quiet. Mary Grace aware of every person they passed, every curious glance. Thomas had helped her into the wagon with the same matter-of-fact courtesy he showed the horses, but she'd felt the calluses on his palm, the careful strength in his grip. Promise Creek's main street bustled with spring activity, ranchers in for supplies, women comparing fabric at the mercantile, children playing in the still muddy street. Mary Grace kept her head up, her back straight, trying to project a confidence she didn't feel. Their first stop was Henderson's mercantile. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who'd sent the dresses, greeted them with warm professionalism. Mr. Wade, good to see you, and you must be Miss Sullivan. How lovely to finally meet you properly. Ma'am, Mary Grace managed, grateful for the woman's tact. They worked through their list efficiently: flour, coffee, salt, various sundries. Mary Grace began to relax, thinking perhaps this wouldn't be as difficult as she'd feared. Then the bell above the door chimed, and Mrs. Carlyle entered with 2 other women in tow. Well, Mrs. Carlyle said, her voice carrying through the store. I see the rumors are true. Thomas Wade has brought his house guest to town. Mary Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks, but before she could respond, Mrs. Henderson intervened. Mrs. Carlyle, have you seen the new fabric shipment I set aside, that blue silk you inquired about? It was a clear dismissal, but Mrs. Carlyle wasn't so easily deterred. Tell me, Miss Sullivan, where did you say you were from? I don't recall Thomas mentioning your connections. I didn't say, Mary Grace replied quietly. But I'm from back east. My family thought the western air would do me good after a recent loss. It was close enough to truth. Mrs. Carlyle's eyes sharpened at the mention of loss. Death was common enough that it served as acceptable explanation for many unconventional situations. I see. And your family approved of your current arrangements. Thomas stepped forward then, his presence solid and unmovable. Miss Sullivan is my employee, Mrs. Carlyle. She maintains her own quarters and conducts herself with complete propriety, unless you're suggesting otherwise. The challenge in his voice was unmistakable. Mrs. Carlyle huffed but subsided, moving toward the fabric counter with her companions. They finished their shopping in tense silence, loading the wagon. Thomas muttered, Oh, Biddy, nothing better to do than make trouble. She's not wrong, though it doesn't look proper. My living there. You planning to let her chase you off? He helped her up to the wagon seat. Because if you are, tell me now. Save us both the trouble of getting used to the arrangement. Mary Grace thought about it as they drove toward their next stop, the feed store at the far end of town. 3 months ago, she would have run at the first sign of difficulty. But something had changed in those quiet winter days, in the steady rhythm of work and the uncomplicated companionship Thomas offered.
No, she said finally. I'm not running. Not from her. Anyway.
Thomas nodded, satisfied. Good, because I've got 22 horses that expect their evening feed, and I'd hate to disappoint them. The feed store brought its own challenges, men who stared openly, conversations that stopped when they entered. But Thomas conducted his business as if nothing was unusual, discussing grain prices and delivery schedules with steady calm. Mary Grace found herself drawing strength from his unbothered demeanor. Their last stop was the small post office. Thomas had mail-waiting business correspondence about the upcoming mail contract renewal. Mary Grace waited by the door, watching the street life, when a young woman approached.
"Excuse me, are you Miss Sullivan?"
Mary Grace tensed.
"Yes."
"I'm Amy Morrison. I teach at the school." The woman was perhaps 25, with kind eyes and ink-stained fingers. "I heard you were educated, Mrs. Henderson mentioned you'd been a teacher's daughter."
"My father taught, yes."
"I wonder. We're terribly short-handed. 2 of our teachers married over the winter and moved away. Would you consider helping out at even just a few hours a week? The pay isn't much, but—"
I don't know. I'd have to discuss it with Mr. Wade."
Amy's face lit up. "Of course, please do. We have 40 students and only 2 teachers. We're quite desperate." As they drove home, wagon loaded with supplies, Mary Grace told Thomas about the offer. "You want to do it?" he asked.
"I don't know. Maybe
it would mean being in town regularly, dealing with more people, more questions. Also means establishing yourself as something other than my mysterious house guest." He glanced at her. Might quiet some of the talk. She hadn't thought of it that way. A respectable position, a purpose beyond the ranch. The horses. "Can spare you a few hours. Managed before you came. Can manage while you're teaching." That evening, as Mary Grace prepared supper, she found herself thinking about the day. Mrs. Carlyle's hostility had been expected, but there had been kindness to Mrs. Henderson's quiet support. Amy Morrison's offer. Perhaps she'd been so focused on what she was running from, she'd forgotten to look for what she might run toward.
"I think I'll write to Miss Morrison,"
she said over dinner.
"Tell her I can help out twice a week to start."
Thomas nodded, passing her the bread. "Good. You're too smart to spend all your time talking to horses."
"I like talking to the horses. They like listening, but children might actually answer back."
It was the closest he'd come to teasing her, and Mary Grace found herself smiling. "That's what I'm afraid of." After supper, as Thomas worked on harness repairs, Mary Grace composed her letter to Amy Morrison. It felt strange, planning for a future beyond the next meal, the next day's chores. For months, she'd lived in the immediate present, too afraid to look forward. But here, in this simple house with its steady rhythms and patient silences, the future seemed less terrifying.
"Thomas,"
she said suddenly,
"thank you for today, for standing up to Mrs. Carlyle."
He looked up from his work. "Don't thank me for doing what's right. You're a good woman, Mary Grace. Anyone suggests otherwise, they'll answer to me." The fierce protectiveness in his voice made her throat tight. She'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone in her corner, someone who saw her as more than a problem to be managed or a mistake to be hidden. That night, as she prepared for bed, Mary Grace unwrapped William's ring one last time. The gold caught the lamplight, symbol of promises broken and futures lost. Tomorrow, she decided, she'd ask Thomas to sell it next time he went to town. Use the money for something practical, new boots, maybe, or books for the school. It was time to stop carrying the weight of what might have been and start building what could be. The winter social at Promise Creek's church was the highlight of February, a chance for the scattered community to gather and forget the cold that still gripped the valley. Mary Grace had been teaching at the school for 3 months now, and while she'd grown comfortable with her students and fellow teachers, the thought of a town-wide social made her stomach flutter with nerves. "You don't have to go," Thomas said for the third time that week, watching her fuss with one of the dresses Mrs. Henderson had given her. They were in the kitchen, late afternoon light slanting through the windows. "Amy expects me to help with the refreshments, and the children have been talking about it for weeks." She smoothed the burgundy wool, trying to see herself as the town might respectable teacher or still the mysterious woman living at Thomas Wade's ranch. "Then we'll go," he said simply, returning to his coffee. The casual "we" stopped her hands. "You're going?" He shrugged. "Haven't missed a winter social in 15 years. No reason to start now." But they both knew there was a reason. His appearance with her would cement the gossip, make their association even more public. Yet he seemed unbothered by the prospect. The night of the social came crisp and clear, stars brilliant in the winter sky. Mary Grace had borrowed Amy's curling iron, attempting to tame her dark hair into something more elaborate than her usual simple bun. Her hands shook as she pinned the last curl. A knock at her door made her jump. "Mary Grace, we should leave soon if we want to arrive before full dark." She opened the door to find Thomas transformed. Gone were the work clothes and weathered coat. He wore a clean white shirt, dark vest, and what must be his Sunday best suit. His hair was slicked back, revealing the strong lines of his face usually hidden by wayward strands. "You clean up well, Mr. Wade," she managed. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. "You look—" He cleared his throat. "You look fine, Miss Sullivan, real fine." The ride to town passed in comfortable silence, the wagon wheels crunching over packed snow. Other wagons and riders converged on the church, lanterns bobbing like fireflies in the darkness. Mary Grace's nervousness returned full force as Thomas helped her down, his hand warm and steady on hers. "Chin up," he murmured. "You faced down Bobby Morrison when he put that frog in Amy's desk. This is nothing compared to that." Despite her nerves, she smiled. Bobby Morrison didn't have Mrs. Carlyle's talent for cutting remarks. "No, but Mrs. Carlyle can't put tadpoles in your soup. Count your blessings." Inside, the church hall glowed with warmth and light. Tables groaned under the weight of food hams and roasted chickens, preserved vegetables, pies and cakes of every description. Musicians tuned their instruments in the corner while children darted between adults' legs, excited by the break from routine. Amy appeared immediately, beaming. "Mary Grace and Mr. Wade, how wonderful. Come, I need your help with the punch bowls." They were swept into the preparations, and Mary Grace found her nervousness easing. Several parents approached to compliment her teaching, and she began to feel less like an outsider. She was arranging cookies on platters when she heard the musicians strike up the first dance. "Miss Sullivan." She turned to find Thomas at her elbow, hand extended. "Would you honor me?" Around them, conversations paused. Mary Grace felt the weight of watching eyes, the held breaths of a community waiting to see what she would do. Part of her wanted to refuse, to retreat to the safety of the refreshment table. But Thomas stood patient, solid, offering not just a dance but a declaration. "This is who we are to each other. Let them make of it what they will." She placed her hand in his. "I'd be honored, Mr. Wade." He led her onto the makeshift dance floor where other couples were forming sets for a reel. Mary Grace hadn't danced since before everything. But Thomas moved with surprising grace for such a large man, guiding her through the steps with gentle pressure and quiet reminders. "Relax," he murmured as they came together in the center. "It's just dancing." People are staring. People always stare. Might as well give them something worth looking at. The next turn brought them close, his hand warm on her waist, and Mary Grace found herself genuinely smiling. When had she last felt young, carefree, allowed to simply enjoy a moment without fear of consequence? They danced 2 more sets before Mary Grace begged for rest, flushed and breathless. Thomas fetched her punch while she fanned herself with Amy's program.
Well,
Mrs. Carlyle materialized beside her, resplendent in black bombazine. Quite the display. Miss Sullivan?
Mrs. Carlyle.
Mary Grace kept her voice pleasant.
Lovely social, isn't it?
Indeed, though some of us remember when Thomas Wade danced with his dear Clara at these events. Such a devoted couple they were. The barb hit its mark, but before Mary Grace could respond, another voice intervened.
Eleanor,
Are you monopolizing Miss Sullivan? Sarah Henderson appeared, linking her arm through Mary Grace's.
I've been wanting to introduce her to the Ladies' Auxiliary. We're always looking for educated women to help with our charity work.
Mrs. Carlyle retreated, outmaneuvered, and Mary Grace found herself surrounded by the town's more progressive matrons. They peppered her with questions about her teaching, her opinions on various charitable causes, her recipe for the molasses cookies Amy had brought.
Don't mind Eleanor, one woman confided. She appointed herself Thomas's guardian after Clara passed, chased off 2 perfectly nice women who showed interest. But you're made of sterner stuff, I can tell.
Mary Grace wasn't sure about that, but she appreciated the support. When Thomas reappeared with her punch, the ladies dispersed with knowing looks. Making friends, he asked.
Apparently, I'm being recruited for the Ladies' Auxiliary.
God help them! But he said it with warmth. The evening progressed with surprising pleasantness. Mary Grace danced with Mr. Henderson, with Amy's father, even with young Bobby Morrison, who solemnly promised no more frogs in the classroom. Between dances, she helped serve refreshments and chatted with parents about their children's progress. It was during a quiet moment that she overheard the conversation that changed everything. Heard from my cousin in Denver. Said a man came through asking about a woman matching her description. Dark hair, educated, left Boston sudden like last winter. Mary Grace froze behind the dessert table, recognizing the voice of the postal clerk.
Someone looking for Miss Sullivan,
another voice asked.
Seems so. Course, could be coincidence.
Lots of dark-haired women in the world. But Mary Grace knew it wasn't coincidence. Whether William had developed a conscience or her stepbrother had decided to pursue what he saw as unfinished business.
Someone was looking for her. The peaceful months in Promise Creek suddenly felt like borrowed time.
She was still standing frozen when Thomas found her. One look at her face and he set down the plates he carried.
What's wrong? I need some air.
He guided her out the side door into the cold night. Mary Grace gulped the winter air, trying to calm her racing heart. Talk to me, Thomas said quietly. She told him what she'd overheard, watched his jaw tighten with each word. Could be nothing, he said finally.
Denver's a long way off. Or it could be someone.
She wrapped her arms around herself.
I should leave. Tonight, before...
Before what? Before someone who might be looking for you might come here. Thomas stepped in front of her, blocking the wind. You planning to run every time you hear a rumor?
This is different. If it's my stepbrother,
then he'll find me standing between him and you. The simple certainty in his voice made her breath catch. Mary Grace, you've built something here. A job, friends, a life.
Don't throw that away for a maybe.
But if I bring trouble to your door, you've brought nothing but good to my door. His hands settled on her shoulders, warm through the wool. I was dying in that house, bit by bit, day by day. Then you showed up, proud and scared and too stubborn to ask for help. And suddenly I had a reason to get up in the morning beyond feeding horses. Mary Grace looked up at him, this man who'd offered shelter without questions, protection without demands. Thomas, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give, he said quietly. But I am asking you to stay, to trust me to handle whatever comes. Inside, she could hear the musicians striking up another dance, life going on, normal and sweet, the life she'd started to believe might be hers.
All right,
she whispered,
I'll stay.
His hands tightened briefly on her shoulders, then released. Good. Now, we should get back before Amy sends a search party. But as they turned toward the door, Mary Grace caught his sleeve. Thomas, would you dance with me again? Let them all see that I'm not going anywhere. A slow smile transformed his usually serious face.
Miss Sullivan, I thought you'd never ask.
They returned to the social hand in hand, causing another ripple of whispers. But Mary Grace held her head high, letting Thomas sweep her into a waltz. Let them talk, she thought. Let whoever was looking for her come. She'd found something worth fighting for, and she wouldn't give it up without a battle. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of music and laughter. When they finally returned to the ranch, Mary Grace felt wrung out but oddly victorious. She'd faced down the town gossips, made real friends, and most importantly, made a choice to stop running. At her door, Thomas paused.
You did well tonight. I had help.
She looked up at him, seeing not her employer or protector, but the man who'd become essential to her daily happiness. Thomas, what you said earlier. I meant every word.
I know. That's what scares me.
She took a breath.
I care for you too. More than I should, probably. But I can't. I'm not ready. I know.
His hand brushed her cheek. The lightest touch. We've got time. Mary Grace, all the time you need. After he left, Mary Grace sat on her bed, still in her good dress, trying to process the evening. The threat of discovery, the promise of protection, the warmth of Thomas's hand in hers as they danced, it was almost too much. But underneath the fear and uncertainty was something else, hope. For the first time since leaving Boston, she could imagine a future that wasn't just about survival, a future with students who needed teaching, friends who offered support, and a man who saw her truly and wanted her anyway. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, in her small room at the back of the house, Mary Grace Sullivan allowed herself to believe in the possibility of happiness. The evening after the winter social started like any other. Mary Grace was mending one of Thomas's work shirts while he oiled leather tack by the fire. A comfortable silence had settled between them, the kind that comes from months of shared routine. Then came the sound that shattered their peace, a distant cry, high and terrified, carried on the wind. Thomas was on his feet instantly. That's the Brennan place. They both knew the Brennans, a young couple with 3 children who had a small farm adjacent to Thomas's property. Without another word, they rushed outside. The cry came again. Clearer now. Definitely a child's voice. Fire! Thomas pointed to an orange glow above the tree line. Their barn. They ran, Thomas grabbing buckets as they passed the well. By the time they reached the Brennan farm, chaos reigned. The barn was fully engulfed, flames licking hungrily at the winter sky. John Brennan and his wife Martha were frantically trying to contain the blaze while their 2 older children huddled nearby. "Where's Samuel?" Martha Brennan screamed, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "He was playing in the loft." Without hesitation, Thomas thrust the buckets at Mary Grace. "Start a bucket line. Get anyone you can—" "Thomas, no!" But he was already running toward the burning structure. Mary Grace organized the growing group of neighbors who had seen the flames. They formed a line from the well, passing buckets hand to hand. But everyone knew it was futile against such a blaze. Her eyes stayed fixed on the barn entrance where Thomas had disappeared. Long, agonizing minutes passed. The roof began to crack ominously. Just when Mary Grace thought she couldn't bear another second, Thomas emerged from the smoke, a small bundle clutched in his arms. He staggered clear of the building just as a section of roof collapsed inward. "Get the doctor!" Mary Grace shouted, rushing to meet him. Thomas laid 7-year-old Samuel on the ground, the boy unconscious but breathing. Thomas himself was swaying, his shirt singed, a nasty burn visible on his left forearm, but he waved off Mary Grace's concern, focusing on the child. He was trapped under feed sacks, Thomas gasped between coughs. Smoke got to him. Doctor, Morrison arrived within minutes, having been summoned by a fast rider. He immediately tended to Samuel, who began coughing and crying the most beautiful sound Mary Grace had ever heard. He'll be fine, the doctor announced. Smoke inhalation, some minor burns, but nothing that won't heal. He turned to Thomas. Now, let me see that arm. Thomas tried to protest, but Mary Grace fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. The doctor cleaned and dressed the burn while the community battled the fire, ultimately saving the house but losing the barn entirely. It was near dawn when Thomas and Mary Grace finally returned home. Thomas's face was gray with exhaustion and pain, though he tried to hide the latter. Mary Grace insisted he sit while she made strong tea with honey for his smoke-raw throat.
That was incredibly foolish,
she said, her voice shaking now that the crisis had passed.
You could have died.
The boy would have died for certain if I hadn't gone in.
I know.
She set the tea before him with trembling hands.
That's what makes you.
He looked up at her, something unguarded in his eyes.
Were you worried about me, Mary Grace?
Terrified.
She admitted, I kept thinking, if something happened to you.
Hey. He caught her hand as she turned away. I'm too stubborn to die easy. Ask anyone. She laughed despite herself.
A watery sound. You need rest, and that dressing will need changing twice a day.
Yes, ma'am. Over the next days, the story spread through Promise Creek like wildfire, how Thomas Wade had rushed into a burning barn without thought for his own safety, how he'd saved the Brennan boy when everyone else stood frozen. People who had whispered about him harboring a mysterious woman now spoke of him with renewed respect. Mary Grace found herself in a new role nursing Thomas through his recovery. The burn was worse than he'd admitted. And Dr. Morrison privately told her to watch for signs of infection. She moved temporarily into the main house to be closer if he needed help during the night. This isn't proper, Thomas protested weakly as she arranged blankets on the settee. Neither is letting you suffer alone, she countered.
Besides, after the social,
I think we've thoroughly scandalized everyone who was inclined to be scandalized. The rest seem to have accepted that we're both too stubborn to be conventional. The first night, she woke to the sound of his restless movements, fever making him toss and mutter. She bathed his face with cool water, changed his dressing, and sat beside him until he settled in his delirium. He called for Clara, and Mary Grace's heart constricted not with jealousy, but with profound sadness for all he'd lost. By the third day, the fever broke. Thomas woke clear-eyed to find Mary Grace asleep in the chair beside his bed, her hand resting on his as if to assure herself he was still there. He studied her face, seeing the exhaustion, the worry lines that hadn't been there before. You stayed, he said softly when she stirred.
Of course I stayed. Where else would I go?
I meant, you could have just checked on me. Didn't have to sit vigil like this. Mary Grace straightened, suddenly self-conscious. Doctor, Morrison said someone should watch for infection. That all it was doctor's orders. She met his gaze steadily.
You know it wasn't.
Something shifted between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of what had been growing for months. But before either could speak further, a knock at the door interrupted. Mary Grace went to answer, returning with a concerned look. Thomas, there's a man here. Says he's looking for someone. A woman who might have come through here last winter. Thomas was out of bed before she could protest, pulling on a shirt despite his bandaged arm. I'll handle this. No, Mary Grace squared her shoulders.
If it's about me, I should face it.
They went to the door together. The man waiting on the porch was well-dressed, travel-worn, with the bearing of someone used to getting answers. Mary Grace's breath caught not her stepbrother, thank God, but she recognized him as one of William's friends from Boston. Mr. Hartley, she said quietly. His eyes widened in recognition. Miss Sullivan, William sent me to find you. Why? Thomas's voice was dangerously quiet.
Hartley glanced between them, clearly assessing the situation. "May I come in? This is a private matter." They led him to the kitchen. Mary Grace made coffee with hands that wanted to shake, while Thomas sat watchful and protective. Hartley cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "William is not well. His marriage is unhappy, and he's been drinking heavily. He speaks of you constantly, of the wrong he did you. He sent me to find you, to beg your forgiveness, to ask you to return." "No." The word came out sharp and immediate. "Whatever William wants, the answer is no." "He says he'll leave his wife, face his family's censure. He wants to make things right." Thomas stood abruptly. The man had his chance to make things right. He chose money and position over Miss Sullivan, and there he caught himself, glancing at Mary Grace. "Over me and our child." Mary Grace finished quietly. "Yes, Mr. Hartley. I was carrying William's child when he chose to marry another. The baby didn't survive, which I'm sure was a relief to everyone concerned." Hartley had the grace to look ashamed. "He didn't know about the child's fate. He torments himself, wondering." "Then let him wonder. Let him torment himself. It's less than I endured." Mary Grace stood, spine straight. "I've built a new life here, Mr. Hartley. I have work I love, people who respect me, a man who—" She stopped, flushing. "A man who would die before letting her be hurt again," Thomas finished. "You can tell William Ashford that Mary Grace Sullivan is under my protection. If he has any honor left, he'll leave her in peace." Hartley studied them both, then nodded slowly. "I see. I'll convey your message." He turned to Mary Grace. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you found happiness. You deserve it." After he left, Mary Grace sank into a chair, shaking. Thomas knelt beside her, his good hand covering hers. "It's over," he said firmly. "You faced him down, told your truth. It's done." "Is it? What if William comes himself? What if—" "Then I'll remind him that, out here, we handle things different than in Boston." His thumb stroked over her knuckles. "You're not alone anymore. Mary Grace, when are you going to believe that—" She looked at him, this man who'd taken her in without questions, who'd risked his life for a neighbor's child, who stood ready to fight her battles without being asked. The walls she'd built so carefully began to crumble. "I lost so much," she whispered. "I'm terrified of losing again." "Can't lose what you don't let yourself have," he replied, "but can't gain anything either." That night, with Thomas settled and resting, Mary Grace made a decision. She took out paper and pen, writing 2 letters. The first was to her mother, brief but honest, telling her she was well and had found a position teaching. She gave the Promise Creek postmaster as a return address. The second letter was harder. She addressed it to William through Mr. Hartley, knowing he would forward it. William, your friend found me as you intended. I am well and have made a life far from Boston and its memories. What we had is past. The child we created did not survive, and perhaps that was mercy. I have found peace here and ask only that you allow me to keep it. Do not seek me again. Live your life as you chose it. I have forgiven you, not for your sake, but for mine. Now let us both move forward. Mary Grace, *. She sealed both letters, feeling lighter than she had in over a year. The past would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her future. In the days that followed, as Thomas recovered fully and they returned to their normal routine, something had fundamentally changed. The careful distance they'd maintained had dissolved. They worked side by side with new ease, hands brushing as they shared tasks, glances holding a moment longer than before. One evening, as Mary Grace prepared to return to her own quarters for the first time since the fire, Thomas caught her hand. "Stay," he said simply. Not like that. Just stay. Have supper with me. Sit by the fire after. It's been nice having you here." She understood what he was asking, not for impropriety, but for companionship.
for the acknowledgement of what was growing between them. "All right," she said, "I'll stay." And she did, that night and many nights after, until the small room at the back of the house stood empty more often than not, and the main house filled with shared laughter and quiet conversations that lasted long into the evening. The town could make of it what they would. Mary Grace had learned there were things more important than reputation, things like courage, loyalty, and the slow, steady building of trust that might, given time, grow into something even deeper. A late spring storm rolled through Promise Creek Valley, bringing unseasonable cold and driving rain. Mary Grace had spent the morning at the schoolhouse, teaching her students while wind rattled the windows. By afternoon, word came that the bridge over Crystal River had washed out, stranding several families on the far side. "We need to get those children home before nightfall." Amy Morrison fretted, peering out at the worsening weather. "The Hendricks family has 3 young ones over there." Mary Grace knew the area rough terrain made more dangerous by the storm. "I'll go to the Wade Ranch," she decided. "Thomas will know what to do." She found him in the barn, already preparing. News traveled fast in a small town, and several neighbors had gathered, discussing rescue plans. "Current's too strong for the usual crossing," Thomas was saying. "But there's an old footbridge about a mile upstream. If it's still standing, we can get people across one at a time." "That's near Devil's Drop," one man protested. "Too dangerous in this weather." "Everything's dangerous in this weather," Thomas replied. "But those families can't spend the night in the cold." Mary Grace approached, rain-soaked from her hurried ride. Thomas's expression softened with concern. "You should be somewhere warm and dry." "So should those children. How can I help?" He started to protest, then seemed to recognize the futility. "Can you help organize supplies? We'll need blankets, rope, food for when we get them back." The rescue party set out within the hour, Thomas, 2 other men, and despite all protests, Mary Grace. She'd pointed out that having a woman along might calm frightened children, and Thomas had reluctantly agreed. The journey was treacherous. Rain had turned the trail to mud, and swollen streams cut across their path. They led the horses when riding became impossible, fighting for every step forward. Mary Grace's skirts, heavy with mud and water, tangled around her legs, but she pressed on without complaint. They found the footbridge intact, but barely so old planks groaning under the assault of wind and spray from the raging river below. On the far side, huddled under a makeshift shelter, were the stranded families, 8 adults and 7 children, including an infant in her mother's arms. "Bridge won't hold much weight," Thomas assessed grimly. "One at a time, children first." The crossing was agonizing to watch. Thomas went first, testing each plank, securing guide ropes. Then, one by one, they brought the children across. The youngest had to be carried, clinging terrified to Thomas's neck as he navigated the swaying bridge. Mary Grace waited on the far side, wrapping each child in blankets, offering reassuring words. Her heart stopped every time the bridge creaked ominously. Every time Thomas disappeared into the spray and mist. They were down to the last family, the Hendricks parents and their infant, when disaster struck. Mrs. Hendricks, paralyzed with fear, had made it halfway across when a plank gave way. She screamed, clinging to the rope as her legs dangled over the churning water below. Without thinking, Mary Grace started onto the bridge. "No!" Thomas shouted, but she was already moving, testing each step, reaching for the terrified woman. "Give me the baby," Mary Grace said firmly. "Mrs." Hendricks was clutching her infant with one arm, the rope with the other, her strength failing. "Trust me, I'll get her to safety. Then Thomas will help you." For a moment, she thought the woman would refuse. Then, with tears streaming, "Mrs." Hendricks passed her precious bundle to Mary Grace. The baby wailed, a healthy sound that cut through the storm's fury. Mary Grace inched backward, every muscle straining. The infant clutched to her chest. The bridge swayed sickeningly,
but she forced herself to move steadily, murmuring nonsense to the baby. "Almost there, little one. Almost safe." She reached solid ground just as Thomas got to Mrs. Hendricks. With the woman's weight redistributed, he was able to guide her to safety. Mr. Hendricks followed, and then they were all across. The rescue complete. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and relief. They distributed the families among various wagons, and Mary Grace found herself in Thomas's wagon with the Hendricks family. The baby had quieted, lulled by the movement, and Mrs. Hendricks gripped Mary Grace's hand. "You saved her," she whispered. "You saved my baby." "We all saved each other," Mary Grace replied, but she was looking at Thomas as she said it. They reached town after dark. Families reunited, everyone safe, doctor. Morrison checked over the children while neighbors provided hot food and dry clothes. It was past midnight when Thomas and Mary Grace finally returned to the ranch. Both were exhausted, soaked through, covered in mud. Thomas built up the fire while Mary Grace changed into dry clothes, a spare dress she kept in the main house for emergencies. When she emerged, he had hot coffee waiting and was examining a cut on his hand he'd gotten from the rope. "Let me see," she said, taking his hand in hers. The cut was deep but clean. She fetched the medical supplies, cleaning and binding the wound with practiced efficiency. "You were incredible today," he said quietly as she worked. "On that bridge, I've never been so scared in my life." "Now you know how I felt watching you run into that burning barn," she replied, securing the bandage. "We make quite a pair. Don't we always rushing into danger?" "Mary Grace." His other hand came up to cup her face. "When I saw you on that bridge, with that baby, all I could think was, I can't lose you, not when I've just found you." Her breath caught. They'd been dancing around this for months, but the day's events had stripped away pretense. "You won't lose me," she whispered. "I'm not going anywhere." He kissed her then, gentle at first, then with growing certainty as she responded. When they finally drew apart, both were breathless. "I love you," he said simply. "I know you've been hurt, know you have every reason not to trust again, but I love you, Mary Grace Sullivan, and I'll wait as long as it takes for you to believe that." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I don't need to wait. I've known for weeks, maybe months. I love you too. I was just too frightened to admit it. And now I'm more frightened of wasting time being afraid." She took a shaky breath. "I lost so much before my child, my faith in people, my sense of self. But you gave it all back to me. Piece by piece, you gave me a home. You gave me a reason to make it a home again," he replied, pulling her close. "This house has been so empty. Mary Grace, but with you here." They sat by the fire, her head on his shoulder, planning in quiet voices. They would marry, of course, but properly, with time for the town to adjust, time to do things right. Mary Grace would continue teaching if she wished. They would build the horse operation together, maybe add cattle as Thomas had considered. "What about children?" Mary Grace asked hesitantly. It was the one fear she hadn't voiced, that her body had been too damaged by loss, that she couldn't give him what Clara hadn't lived to provide. "If we're blessed with them, wonderful," Thomas said firmly. "If not, then we'll love each other and make our own family. There are always children needing help, like today. We could make a difference that way too." His easy acceptance of any outcome eased the knot in her chest. This was why she loved him. He never demanded more than she could give, never made her feel less than whole. A knock at the door interrupted them. Thomas frowned at the late hour, but went to answer. Mary Grace heard familiar voices and came to see. The Hendricks family stood on the porch, Mr. Hendricks holding a bundle. "Sorry for the late hour," he said, "but we couldn't go home without—" He thrust the bundle at Thomas. "This is for you both, from all of us who were trapped today." Inside was a quilt, handmade, with each rescued family's name embroidered in a corner. In the center, stitched in careful letters,
To Thomas Wade and Mary Grace Sullivan, heroes of Crystal River Crossing. "We've been working on it since the barn fire," Mrs. Hendricks explained, tears in her eyes. "Seemed like you two were always saving folks. Figured it was time someone thanked you proper." Mary Grace touched the quilt with trembling fingers. "It's beautiful. We can't—" "You can and you will, Mr. Hendricks said firmly. "And when you two finally make it official, oh, don't look surprised. Whole town knows it's coming. This'll look real nice in your home." After they left, Mary Grace and Thomas spread the quilt across the settee, admiring the careful stitchwork. Each name represented a life touched, a connection made. Without planning to, they'd become part of the fabric of Promise Creek. "No more running," Mary Grace said softly. "This is home." "No more hiding," Thomas agreed. "This is us." The storm had passed, leaving the night clear and star-filled. Through the window, they could see the moon reflecting off puddles in the yard, turning them to silver. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: cleanup from the storm, repairs to bridges and buildings, the ongoing work of ranch and school. But tonight, wrapped in a quilt made of gratitude and love, Thomas Wade and Mary Grace Sullivan sat together and planned their future. They'd both known loss, both built walls against further hurt. Now, brick by brick, they dismantled those walls, finding in each other not just love, but partnership, understanding, and the courage to trust again. "I should go to my room," Mary Grace said eventually, though she made no move to rise. "Stay," Thomas said, as he had so many times before. "But this time," he added, "just to sleep, just to be near. We'll do everything proper come morning." She stayed, curled against him on the settee, the quilt covering them both. And for the first time since she'd stumbled onto his porch in a blizzard, Mary Grace Sullivan felt truly, completely safe. Not just from the storms outside, but from the storms within. Home, she thought drowsily. After all the running, all the fear, she was finally home. Summer arrived in Promise Creek with a vengeance, bringing dust and heat that shimmered off the hard-packed earth. It had been 2 months since the night of the storm. 2 months since Thomas and Mary Grace had declared their love. They'd taken things slowly, courting properly under the watchful eyes of the town, though everyone knew where the relationship was headed. This particular morning, Mary Grace was in the garden she'd started behind the house, coaxing vegetables from the dry soil, when she heard the sound of a child crying. Not the normal cry of a scraped knee or lost toy, but something deeper, more desperate. She found the source quickly: a small boy, perhaps 6 years old, huddled beneath the large oak tree at the edge of Thomas's property. His clothes were torn and dusty, his feet bare and bleeding. "Hello there," Mary Grace said softly, approaching as she would a frightened colt. "I'm Miss Mary Grace. What's your name?" The boy looked up with huge brown eyes. "Ben," he whispered. "Benjamin Carter." Mary Grace's heart clenched. The Carters were a family from the far side of the valley. Known for their harsh ways, she'd heard whispers at the mercantile, concerns from other mothers. But frontier justice didn't extend easily into family matters. "Are you hurt, Ben?" She knelt beside him, noting the bruises on his thin arms, the way he flinched from even her gentle presence. "I runned away," he said. "Papa was mad 'cause I dropped the eggs. I didn't mean to. They was too heavy." "Of course you didn't mean to." Mary Grace kept her voice calm, though rage burned in her chest. "How about we get you some water and food? Would that be all right?" Ben nodded tentatively. Mary Grace led him to the house, settling him at the kitchen table. She brought water first, then bread with butter and jam. The way he fell upon the food told her he'd been hungry for more than just the morning. Thomas came in from the barn, stopping short at the sight of their small visitor. Mary Grace caught his eye, shaking her head slightly. He understood immediately, approaching slowly. "This is Mr. Thomas," Mary Grace said. "This is his house. He's very nice." "Are you going to send me back?" Ben asked, shrinking in his chair. Not until you're ready. Thomas said firmly, "A man's house is a sanctuary. You're safe here, son." Over the next hours, as Ben slowly relaxed, the story emerged in pieces. His mother had died the previous winter. His father, overwhelmed with 3 children and a failing farm, had taken to drink and worse. Ben was the youngest, the smallest, the easiest target for frustration. "My sister Lily tries to stop him sometimes," Ben said, his small fingers twisting in his lap. "But then he gets madder." Mary Grace exchanged a look with Thomas. They both knew something had to be done. But what the law was reluctant to interfere in family discipline, and taking the boy back might only make things worse. "I'll ride out to the Carter place," Thomas said quietly. "Talk to the man." "He won't listen," Mary Grace said. "Men like that never do." "Then I'll make him listen." But before Thomas could leave, they heard horses approaching. Ben went rigid with fear, and Mary Grace quickly moved him behind her skirts. Through the window, she could see Samuel Carter, a large man with mean eyes and the unsteady gait of someone who started drinking early. "I know my boy's here," Carter shouted from the yard. "Saw his tracks leading this way. You send him out now." Thomas stepped onto the porch, Mary Grace and Ben behind him. "The boy came here seeking help. Carter, seems to me a father might ask why his son ran rather than demanding him back." "Don't need no horse trainer telling me how to raise my young'uns." Carter's face was red, fists clenched. "Boy's got chores. He comes home now, or I come get him." "You're welcome to try," Thomas said mildly. But Mary Grace heard steel beneath the calm. Carter took a step forward, then seemed to register Thomas's size, the way he stood balanced and ready. "You threatening me? Wade." Stating facts. The boy's scared, hungry, and hurt. In my book, that makes him a guest under my protection until we sort this out. "Ain't nothing to sort. He's my blood." "Blood doesn't give you the right to harm a child." Mary Grace stepped forward, unable to contain herself longer. "This boy has bruises. Mr. Carter, he's terrified of you." "Women," Carter spat. "Always coddling, making boys soft? This what you want? Wade, some Eastern woman telling you how to run things?" "Seems to me Miss Sullivan's got more sense than both of us combined," Thomas replied. "Now, here's what's going to happen. Ben stays here today. You go home, sober up, and think about what kind of father you want to be. Tomorrow, we'll talk about this proper. And if I don't agree to your terms, then I ride into town and have a conversation with Sheriff Morrison. He's been looking for an excuse to check on your farm, what with all the complaints from neighbors about neglected stock and children running wild." It was partly bluff the sheriff had limited authority, but Carter didn't know that. He glared, spat in the dust, but finally backed down. "One day," he growled. "Then the boy comes home." After he left, Ben collapsed against Mary Grace, sobbing. She held him while Thomas paced, both knowing they'd only delayed the inevitable. "We need a better plan," Mary Grace said. "I know." Thomas ran his hand through his hair. "Let me think on it." That afternoon, while Ben napped on the settee, exhausted from his ordeal, an unexpected solution presented itself. Amy Morrison arrived with her uncle, Judge Morrison, who happened to be visiting from the county seat. "Heard there was some trouble out here," the judge said, settling his considerable bulk into a chair. "Young Ben Carter, is it?" Mary Grace explained the situation while the judge listened, occasionally nodding. When she finished, he stroked his beard thoughtfully. "Been getting reports about the Carter place for months. Stock wandering onto other people's property. Older children seen begging food in town. Man's drowning in his grief and taking everyone down with him." "So what can be done?" Thomas asked. "Well, now." The judge leaned back. "There's precedent for removing children from homes where they're in danger. Not common, mind you, but possible. Would need someone willing to take responsibility for them. Though..."
Mary Grace's heart leapt. We would. Thomas and I. We could. You're not married yet, the judge pointed out gently. Makes it complicated. Then we'll get married, Thomas said immediately. Been planning on it anyway. Mary Grace turned to him. Thomas, that's not how I wanted. Nothing about our story's been conventional, he said, taking her hands. Why start now, Mary Grace Sullivan? Will you marry me today, so we can protect that little boy and maybe his siblings too? It wasn't the proposal either had imagined no moonlight, no carefully prepared words, but looking at Thomas's earnest face, thinking of Ben sleeping trustingly on their settee. Mary Grace knew it was perfect. Yes, she said, yes, of course. The judge smiled. Well then, good thing I've got authority to perform ceremonies. Amy, run fetch the Hendersons for witnesses. Let's make this legal. The wedding was unlike anything in Mary Grace's long-ago dreams. She wore her everyday dress, Thomas his work clothes. The ceremony took place in the kitchen, with Amy Morrison and the Hendersons as witnesses, Ben still sleeping nearby. But when Thomas slipped his mother's ring onto her finger produced from some hiding place she hadn't known about, Mary Grace felt more truly married than any grand ceremony could have made her. By the power vested in me by the state of Montana, Judge Morrison intoned, I pronounce you husband and wife. Thomas, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was brief, sweet, full of promise. Then reality crashed back as Ben stirred, waking confused to find the kitchen full of people. It's all right, Mary Grace soothed. Ben, how would you like to stay here with us? Not just today, but for a while. Hope dawned in the boy's eyes. Really, you mean it? We mean it, Thomas confirmed. The judge is going to talk to your father, see about making it official. And maybe your brother and sister could visit too, if they'd like. The next morning, a delegation visited the Carter farm Judge Morrison, Sheriff Morrison, Thomas, and several neighboring ranchers. What they found confirmed their worst fears: a farm in disarray, 2 older children trying desperately to hold things together, and Samuel Carter passed out drunk at midday. The confrontation was brief, faced with the combined authority of judge and sheriff, plus the implied threat of his neighbor's disapproval. Carter agreed to a temporary guardianship arrangement. The children would stay with responsible families while he sorted himself out. If he could prove sobriety and stability in 6 months, they could revisit the arrangement. And if not, Carter asked belligerently, then the arrangement becomes permanent, the judge said firmly. These children deserve better than what you're giving them. Carter, this is your chance to become the father they need. Don't waste it. Ben's siblings, 12-year-old Lily and 10-year-old James, were placed with the Hendersons, close enough to visit, but giving each child individual attention they desperately needed. Ben settled into the Wade household with an ease that broke Mary Grace's heart, so grateful for simple kindness that he followed her like a shadow. That night, as they tucked Ben into the small room that had once been Mary Grace's, Thomas pulled her close. Not quite how I imagined our wedding night, he murmured. No, she agreed, listening to Ben's peaceful breathing. It's better. We're not just building a marriage. Thomas, we're building a family. No regrets about the rushed ceremony. Mary Grace thought about it. A year ago, she'd been running, broken, certain she'd never love or trust again. Now she had a husband who'd do anything to protect the innocent, a home filled with purpose, and a child who needed them. No regrets, she said firmly. We'll have our whole lives for romance. Today, we did what mattered. Have I told you today that I love you, Mrs. Wade? The name sent a thrill through her. Not in the last hour, Mr. Wade. He remedied that situation thoroughly, and later, as they lay listening to the night sounds, horses nickering, wind in the oak tree, Ben occasionally murmuring in his sleep, Mary Grace marveled at how differently her life had turned out than planned. She'd thought she wanted a conventional life, proper courtship, society wedding, children born to her body. Instead,
She'd found something richer, a love born of mutual respect and shared trials, a marriage consecrated by the desire to protect others, and a family formed not by blood but by choice. Tomorrow would bring challenges. Samuel Carter might cause trouble. Ben would need patience and healing from his trauma. The town would gossip about their sudden wedding. But tonight, in her husband's arms, with a rescued child safe under their roof, Mary Grace Wade knew she was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes the best families were the ones you built from broken pieces, mortared together with love and determination. And sometimes, the most perfect moments came disguised as ordinary Tuesday afternoons when you simply said yes to what life offered, even if it wasn't what you'd planned. Especially then. The leaves were turning gold and crimson when Mary Grace realized she was carrying a child. She'd suspected for weeks but hadn't dared hope, not after her previous loss. She stood in the kitchen, one hand pressed to her still flat stomach, the other gripping the table for support as the certainty washed over her. "Mary, you all right?" Thomas entered from the barn, Ben trailing behind him with an armload of kindling. The boy had been with them 4 months now, growing stronger and more confident each day. Yes, Ben. Would you take the kindling to the wood box? There's cookies in the jar when you're done." Ben scampered off, and Mary Grace turned to her husband, the words stuck in her throat. How did you tell someone who'd already lost one family that you were risking building another? "What is it?" Thomas crossed to her, concern creasing his brow. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Not a ghost." She took his hand, placed it over her stomach. "A future. Thomas, I'm going to have a baby." The emotions that crossed his face were too complex to name joy. Fear, wonder, worry, and finally, overwhelmingly, love. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be. I recognize the signs." Her voice caught. "I'm terrified." "Me too," he admitted. "But we'll face it together, like everything else." They held each other in the kitchen while outside. Ben's cheerful humming drifted from the woodshed. Their little family was growing. Dr. Morrison confirmed her suspicions the next week. "Everything seems fine. Mrs. Wade, you're young, healthy. There's no reason to expect anything but a normal pregnancy." "I lost one before," Mary Grace said quietly. "Back in Boston." The doctor's face softened. "I know. Thomas told me. Wanted me to be aware. We'll watch you carefully, but try not to borrow trouble. Every pregnancy is different." Word spread through Promise Creek as these things do. Some of the whispers were kind, how wonderful for the Wades. After all they'd been through. Others were less so, wondering if a woman who'd lost one child out of wedlock deserved another chance. Mrs. Carlyle, predictably, had opinions. She cornered Mary Grace outside the Mercantile on a crisp October morning. "Rather soon, isn't it?" she said archly. "You've barely been married 4 months." Mary Grace, who would have shrunk from such confrontation a year ago, met her gaze steadily. "My husband and I are blessed. I'm sorry if the timing doesn't meet with your approval, but I've learned life doesn't wait for perfect moments." "Indeed. And what of the boy? How will he feel, pushed aside for your natural child?" That touched a real fear, but Mary Grace wouldn't give Mrs. Carlyle the satisfaction. "Ben is our son in every way that matters. This baby will be his sibling. Our family has room for both." She walked away before Mrs. Carlyle could respond, head high despite the trembling in her legs. In the wagon, Ben was waiting with Thomas, practicing his letters on a slate. "Did you get the fabric?" Ben asked. He'd been excited about the new baby since they'd told him, particularly about being a big brother. "I did, blue and yellow, like you suggested." She ruffled his hair. "Very good choice." As they drove home, Thomas reached over to squeeze her hand. "Heard you standing up to Eleanor Carlyle. Getting quite a reputation as a woman not to be crossed." "Good," Mary Grace said firmly.
I'm tired of apologizing for existing.
The pregnancy progressed with the changing seasons. Mary Grace continued teaching as long as she could, her students delighted by the prospect of their teacher having a baby. Amy Morrison had already agreed to take over when needed. Ben threw himself into preparations with touching enthusiasm. He helped Thomas build a cradle, sanded it smooth with patient care. He practiced holding Amy's infant nephew, supporting the head just so. When Mary Grace was tired, he'd bring her tea without being asked, proud of his helpfulness. "I'm gonna be the best big brother," he announced one evening. Better than James, even. His own brother visited weekly, their relationship slowly mending after the trauma of their early loss. "You already are," Mary Grace assured him.
This baby is lucky to have you.
But as winter deepened, so did her fears. The baby was active, healthy by all signs, but memories of her first pregnancy haunted her. She'd been so certain then, so naive about what could go wrong. Thomas found her crying one night, curled in the rocking chair he'd placed by their bedroom window. "Talk to me," he said simply, kneeling beside her. "What if I lose this one too? What if my body can't? What if I'm being punished for before?" "Stop." His voice was gentle but firm. "You're not being punished. What happened before was tragedy, not judgment. And if God forbid something goes wrong, we'll face that too. But Mary, you can't live this pregnancy in fear. It's not good for you or the baby."
I know, I love it so much already. And you, and Ben, I have so much now. It feels like tempting fate.
"Then we'll be grateful for each day we have." Thomas said, "That's all anyone can do." As her time drew near, the community rallied around them in ways that touched Mary Grace deeply. Women who'd whispered about her a year ago now brought baby clothes and advice. The church ladies organized a rotation of meals for after the birth, even Mrs. Carlyle sent a beautifully knitted blanket, though she delivered it through Amy rather than coming herself. The labor began on a February night with snow falling soft and thick. Mary Grace woke to the familiar tightening, the deep ache that said her time had come. Terror and joy warred in her chest.
"Thomas,"
she whispered.
"it's starting."
He was instantly alert, lighting lamps, stoking the fire. "I'll get Dr. Morrison."
"Not yet. It's early still. But send Ben to stay with the Hendersons."
Ben, woken by the activity, was wide-eyed but brave.
"Is the baby coming?"
"Yes, sweetheart. You go with Mr. Henderson when he comes. We'll send word as soon as your brother or sister arrives."
"I'll be good,"
Ben promised solemnly. "And I'll say prayers for you and the baby." Mary Grace hugged him tight, this boy who'd taught her that family could be chosen as well as born. The labor was long but mercifully straightforward. Sarah Henderson came to help, her calm presence a blessing. Thomas stayed close, letting Mary Grace grip his hand through the worst pains, murmuring encouragement when she faltered.
"I can't,"
she gasped at one point.
"It's too hard."
"You can," he said firmly.
"You're the strongest woman I know. You survived loss and heartbreak. You started over in a strange place. You stood up to the whole town to protect Ben. You can do this."
And she did. As dawn broke over Promise Creek, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that was the sweetest sound Mary Grace had ever heard. Tiny, perfect, alive. "A girl." "Doctor," Morrison announced, placing the baby on Mary Grace's chest. "Healthy and whole." Mary Grace wept, holding her daughter while Thomas stroked the baby's downy head with one trembling finger. "She's beautiful," he whispered. "What should we call her?" Mary Grace had thought about this.
"Hope," she said. "Hope Clara Wade. For the future, and for the past that brought us here."
Thomas's eyes filled. Perfect. Ben was brought home that afternoon, approaching the bedroom shyly. Mary Grace was propped against pillows, the baby sleeping in her arms.
"Come meet your sister,"
she said softly. Ben crept close, eyes huge.
"She's so small. Was I ever that small?"
All babies start small, Thomas said, lifting Ben so he could see better. But they grow, just like you're growing. Can I touch her? Very gently, Mary Grace said. Ben reached out one finger, stroking Hope's cheek with infinite care. Hi, Hope, he whispered. I'm Ben. I'm your big brother. I'm gonna take care of you, promise. The baby stirred, tiny fingers grasping Ben's finger. The boy's face lit with wonder. She likes me. Of course she does, Mary Grace said. She knows your family. In the days that followed, life settled into a new rhythm. Ben proved as helpful as he'd promised, fetching diapers and singing to Hope when she fussed. Thomas balanced farm work with doting on his daughter, often carrying her in a sling while he worked in the barn. The christening was held on a bright March Sunday. The church was full not just out of curiosity this time, but genuine celebration for a family that had become part of Promise Creek's heart. Judge Morrison had returned to stand as godfather, while Amy Morrison and Sarah Henderson served as godmothers. As Reverend Philip sprinkled water on Hope's head, Mary Grace looked around the congregation. There was Mrs. Carlyle, actually smiling. The Brennan family, whose barn fire had brought Thomas and Mary Grace together. The rescued families from the flood, her students and their parents. A year and a half ago, she'd arrived in Promise Creek with nothing but grief and fear. Now she stood here with a husband who loved her, a son they'd chosen, a daughter they'd been blessed with, and a community that had become home. After the service, as people gathered to admire the baby and congratulate the family, Ben tugged on Mary Grace's skirt. Mama, he said shyly. He'd never called her that before. Always Miss Mary Grace or nothing at all. Yes, sweetheart. Is it okay that we're different? Our family, some kids say it's strange that I'm not really yours. Mary Grace knelt, despite her still healing body, and took his hands. Do you know what makes a family, Ben? He shook his head. Love, that's all. Not blood, not names, not how you come together. Just love. You are absolutely, completely, really mine. Mine and Papa's. Hope is lucky to have you as a brother, and we're lucky to have you as a son. Forever. Forever and always. Thomas confirmed, joining them with Hope in his arms. We're the Wade family, all four of us. Ben threw his arms around Mary Grace's neck. I love you, Mama. I love you too, my boy. That night, after the guests had gone and the children were asleep, Thomas and Mary Grace sat on their porch despite the chill, wrapped in the quilt the town had given them. No regrets, Thomas asked, their old question. Mary Grace thought of all the paths that had led here, the pain, the loss, the fear, but also the courage, the kindness, the unexpected grace of second chances. No regrets, she said, not one. In the house behind them, their children slept, one born of choice, one of their bodies, both of love. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and joys, but tonight, under the vast Montana sky, the Wade family was complete. Sometimes the most beautiful stories were written not in grand gestures, but in small moments of choosing love over fear, hope over heartbreak, and family over convention. Mary Grace had learned that the hard way. Now, she got to live it every single day. 5 years had passed since Hope's birth, and the Wade Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in Promise Creek Valley. Thomas had expanded the horse operation, adding cattle as he'd long planned. While Mary Grace balanced motherhood with teaching part-time at the school, Ben, now 11, had grown into a confident, caring boy who helped with the ranch work and doted on his little sister. On this particular autumn evening, the family gathered on the porch as was their custom, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. Hope, a spirited 5-year-old with her mother's dark hair and her father's steady gaze, sat on Ben's lap as he read to her from a storybook.
And they lived happily ever after.
Ben finished, closing the book.
Read it again,
Hope demanded, as she did every night.
Tomorrow, little one,
Mary Grace said, lifting her daughter. Time for bed. As she carried Hope inside, Thomas noticed a rider approaching in the distance. His hand moved instinctively to the rifle propped against the porch rail, old habits from rougher times, then relaxed as he recognized the horse.
It's Sheriff Morrison,
he told Ben.
Wonder what brings him out this way so late.
The sheriff dismounted, his face grave. Evening. Thomas, Ben, might be best if you head inside.
Ben can stay, Thomas said firmly. He's part of this family.
Morrison nodded. Fair enough. I've got news. Samuel Carter died 2 days ago. Drunk, fell off his horse, broke his neck.
Ben went very still.
Thomas put a protective hand on the boy's shoulder. The other children, Thomas asked.
That's why I'm here. Lily's of age now, planning to marry the Hendrick boy. But James, he's been living rough since he turned 16, working odd jobs. He's in some trouble, nothing serious, but he needs family, real family.
He has family, Ben said quietly.
He has me.
Thomas and the sheriff both looked at the boy, who straightened his shoulders.
James is my brother. We should help him.
Mary Grace had returned, having heard the last of the conversation. She moved to stand beside her family.
Of course we should. Sheriff, where is James now?
County jail, waiting on a judge for a minor theft charge. Stole food. Mainly, boy's been hungry. We'll come tomorrow, Thomas said. Post his bail. Speak on his behalf.
After the sheriff left, the family sat in quiet conference. James was 18 now, technically a man, but still young enough to need guidance. He might not want our help,
Mary Grace warned gently.
He's proud, like someone else I know.
She smiled at Ben. But we have to try, Ben insisted.
Family doesn't give up on each other. You taught me that.
The next morning, they made the journey to the county seat. The jail was a grim place, and Mary Grace kept Hope close while Thomas and Ben went to see James. They found a young man who looked too much like Ben for comfort, same brown eyes, same stubborn chin, but harder, marked by years of struggle. He stared at them through the bars, expression wary.
Come to gloat,
he asked Ben bitterly.
See how the brother who got left behind turned out?
Come to bring you home, Ben said simply.
If you'll let us.
James laughed harshly.
Home, I don't have a home.
You do, Thomas said. With us, if you want it. No conditions, no judgments, just family.
I'm not a child, don't need charity.
Not offering charity? Thomas replied. Offering work. Ranch is growing. Could use another hand. Fair wages, room and board. And your brother misses you. James's tough facade cracked slightly as he looked at Ben.
You've grown? So have you,
Ben said.
James, please.
I know you're angry.
I was angry too, when everything happened. But the Wades took me in, gave me a real family. They'd do the same for you.
I'm not like you, James said.
I've done things, stolen, fought, spent more nights drunk than sober. You survived, Ben said firmly. That's what matters. Everything else can be fixed.
Mary Grace entered then,
Hope on her hip.
James's eyes widened at the sight of the little girl. This is Hope, Ben said proudly. My sister, Hope. This is your Uncle James. Hope, with a child's innocent directness, smiled at James.
Hi, Ben talks about you. He says you taught him to whistle. Can you teach me?
Something in James's hard expression softened.
Maybe.
Please come home, Ben said one more time. We're family. That has to mean something. It took time posting bail, speaking to the judge, convincing James to give them a chance. But by evening, they were heading back to Promise Creek with one more passenger in the wagon. James sat stiffly, clearly uncomfortable.
"I don't know how to be part of a regular family," he admitted as they neared the ranch.
"Neither did I," Mary Grace said gently. "I showed up on Thomas's porch in a snowstorm, half frozen and running from my past. He took me in anyway, and I was just a scared kid who'd been hurt," Ben added.
"But they loved me anyway.
"They'll love you too, if you let them."
The adjustment wasn't easy. James had spent years fending for himself, trusting no one. He was surly at meals, worked himself to exhaustion trying to prove his worth, and flinched from any show of affection. But slowly, patiently, the family wore down his defenses. Hope, especially, seemed to have a gift for it. She'd appear wherever James was working, chattering about her day, asking endless questions. She brought him flowers, drew him pictures, declared him her favorite uncle, despite him being her only uncle. One evening, Mary Grace found James in the barn, Hope asleep in his lap while he repaired a bridle. "She insisted on helping," he said gruffly. Fell asleep mid-sentence.
"She feels safe with you," Mary Grace observed. "Children know who they can trust."
James's throat worked.
"I don't deserve it, any of this."
"Deserve has nothing to do with it," Mary Grace said.
"This is family. We choose each other, flaws and all."
"Ben got lucky, finding you and Thomas."
"We got lucky finding him. And now you."
She touched his shoulder gently.
"James, you're not taking anything from anyone by being here. You're adding to our family. Ben's happier with you here. Hope adores you. Thomas respects your work ethic. And I'm grateful my children have an uncle who fought so hard to survive."
That was the night James finally broke down, years of hurt and loneliness pouring out. Mary Grace held him while he wept. This young man who'd been forced to be strong too early, just as she had. Christmas came with snow and celebration. The house was full. Lily came with her new husband. The Hendersons visited. Amy Morrison brought her family. But the moment Mary Grace treasured most was Christmas morning, when James presented Ben with a carved whistle.
"Figured I owed you a new one," he said shyly, "since I broke the last one when we were kids."
Ben hugged his brother fiercely.
"We're together now. That's all that matters."
As winter melted into spring, Mary Grace often reflected on the journey that had brought them all here. A widow and widower, both broken by loss. 3 orphaned siblings, separated by tragedy. A baby born from hope and determination. Somehow, they'd formed a family stronger than any conventional bond. One evening, as they all sat for supper, Thomas and Mary Grace, Ben and James. Little Hope in her high chair, Thomas raised his coffee cup.
"A toast," he said, "to family, however it comes together."
"To second chances," Mary Grace added.
"To not giving up," Ben contributed.
"To coming home," James said quietly.
"To whistles,"
Hope shouted, making everyone laugh. They clinked cups and glasses. This unlikely family bound by choice and love rather than blood alone. Outside, the Montana sky stretched endless and free, full of stars and possibilities. That night, as Thomas and Mary Grace prepared for bed, he pulled her close. "Think we're done adding to this family?" he asked with a smile. Mary Grace considered. "You never know who might need us next, or who we might need."
"No regrets."
She thought of the girl who'd stumbled onto his porch 6 years ago, lost, grieving, certain she'd never know happiness again. That girl could never have imagined this life, a loving husband, 3 wonderful children, a home built on understanding and acceptance.
"Not a single one," she said, meaning it completely.
In the children's rooms, Ben and James talked quietly, brothers reunited and healing together. Hope slept peacefully, clutching the rag doll Lily had made her, dreaming whatever dreams visit children who've only known love. The Wade family was complete, not perfect, never that, but whole in all the ways that mattered. They'd all come to this ranch by different roads, some smooth and some rocky, but they'd found their destination in each other. And, in the end, that's what family truly was, not just the people you were born to, but the people who showed up when you needed them,
Who stayed when leaving would be easier? Who chose love when the world gave them every reason to choose fear? They'd all learned that lesson in their own time, in their own way. Now they lived it, day by day, season by season, under the vast Montana sky that had witnessed so many stories of loss and redemption, heartbreak and hope. The Wade Ranch stood as testament to a simple truth. Sometimes the most beautiful families were built from broken pieces, and sometimes the strongest love grew from the rockiest soil. All it took was courage, patience, and the willingness to say yes when life offered unexpected gifts, even if they came disguised as a stranger on your porch in a snowstorm. Thank you so much for listening to this story. If you enjoyed following the journey of Mary Grace and Thomas Wade, I'd love to hear where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss what touched your heart in this tale. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and hit that like button. And if this story moved you, please consider pressing the hype button to help more people discover these heartfelt tales of love and redemption in the American frontier. Until next time, partners.